Welcome to Episode 8 in this series of podcasts on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Last episode, we talked about the beginning of Frankenstein's narrative, which is itself a frame narrative within Captain Walton's own story. We saw in chapters 1 to 3 how Frankenstein grew up in an idyllic place, but was slowly introduced to loss through the death of his mother and the experiences of his orphaned friend, Elizabeth. At university, he learnt the modern sciences and embraced Enlightenment thinking, but didn't completely give up on more idealistic, emotion-based science that he had learned reading books as a child. This in turn led to him experimenting on cadavers, disrupting death while at the same time trying to find the secret to life. In Chapter 3, he succeeded, and now, in Chapter 4, he applies what he has learnt.
Chapter 4 opens with summer behind Frankenstein. The nights are getting longer, and it is during one particularly dreary night in November that we rejoin him in the process of creating life from death for the first time. The way this scene is constructed by Shelley is important. There are regular allusions to light and dark, life and death, even rain versus the sun. At this moment, Frankenstein is fervently working in the dark, trying to illuminate it with new knowledge. But we know that often where there is darkness there is danger, and this is even more true in Gothic writing. Therefore, there is immediately a great tension at the beginning of the chapter.
Sci-fi elements are also making themselves known at this point in the book. Frankenstein draws the link with the electricity that brought death to the oak in an earlier chapter, and is hoping to channel its power to bring life as well. Frankenstein recounts to Walton how he collected various instruments around him, with the goal of infusing a spark of being into the lifeless thing at his feet.
Victor is filled with a nervous and anxious energy. We've seen in the preceding chapter how he has spent months developing the technique to bring life to his work, and has diligently worked to harvest the most beautiful and proportioned cadavers for his creation. As the moment draws ever nearer, the scene appears to crackle with energy. Throughout the sequence, we hear how Victor has worked through infinite pains and care to create this being. His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Yet as the creature awakens, it is not a pure, innocent or beautiful Adam we see lying before us, but a wretch, which fills Frankenstein's heart with disgust and breathless horror.
And what a monstrous wretch it is! The descriptions of the creature harbour all the classic imagery and uncanny inversions of the Gothic tradition, invoking the concept of the monstrous that we talked about in Episode 5. It's worth looking at this passage in depth.
How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shrivelled complexion and straight black lips.
This creature, which is supposedly formed of the most perfect elements of man, lies before us as a disturbing, uncanny and disgusting accumulation. Shelley uses a lot of very important juxtapositions and contrasting images in this section, detailing the lustrous black hair and pearly white teeth, which under the light of day contrast grotesquely with his yellowed skin and black lips. Despite his lively and beautiful features, hues and shades of death linger in the sallow skin, dun eye sockets and black lips. The creature becomes the very embodiment of the uncanny, unsettling the order between life and death, human and non-human. The creature is essentially the monstrous other, which plays such a big role in Gothic writing, given form. Note as well the obvious colouring of the monster. Because he doesn't bear the skin tone of his creator, he is not only not human, he's also not native to these lands. In this sense, the monster is about as other as a living thing can be, with no familiar links to the place or persons from which it is born.
The disturbing inversion of the creature, a monster crafted from the most beautiful elements of man, leads Victor to instantly and viciously reject his creation at the moment of its birth. After months of agony and arduous labour, his work culminates in the creation of an abject horror, a being which unsettles the very harmony and balance of the natural world. We see Victor's repulsion through the use of exclamations and rhetorical questions, as if he is wholly unable to process the body which lies in front of him.
While the majority of this scene attends to the monstrous description of the creature, Shelley also alerts us to the state of the monster as an infant, which Victor ultimately abandons.
His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs.
This is the crucial moment of abandonment. Unable to speak, moving clumsily and grinning, Frankenstein's description of the monster aligns with those of a newborn child still taking in the world. That Frankenstein flees from his creation at this pivotal moment creates a trauma in both of them that resonates throughout the rest of the novel. It is the reason for so many of the monster's later horrific acts, and sets Frankenstein on the path that leaves him alone on the ice, abandoned and desperate.
After fleeing from the monster, Frankenstein falls into a fever and dreams deeply. These dreams serve as a premonition of what's to come in the novel. Most vivid of all these dreams is one he has regarding Elizabeth, who he comes across in the streets of Ingolstadt.
Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel.
We've already seen such lips, livid with the hue of death, in the description of the creature. Here, though, the lips are symbolic of Elizabeth's death, and signal a broader link to the loss of Frankenstein's mother. The dream acts as a premonition of the death of various members of Victor's family, and finally of his love, Elizabeth. It's a moment of heavy foreshadowing, and as a result, deepens our feeling of dread.
Frankenstein's immediate succumbing to this psychological illness and the decline of his physical body mirror the moral decline which he has been following in creating the monster and transgressing against nature. As we noted earlier, it is an ironic consequence of his wish to banish disease from the human world. His gradual physical and psychological decline also echoes the subtitle of the novel, reminding us of Prometheus, who was punished for his transgressions for eternity. Knowing what we do about the myth of Prometheus, we suspect that this is only the beginning of Frankenstein's suffering.
As the chapters progress, Frankenstein does eventually recover, with the help of his good friend Henry Clerval. As spring blooms, Victor becomes rejuvenated, and his recovery is mirrored by the natural blossoming and improved light as they move out of winter. Keep this in mind as we read the book. Winter, the cold, and the dark all become synonymous with death and disruption throughout the novel. Never forget that Frankenstein's own narrative is framed by the landscape of the Arctic North, a hint to us readers that this is not a tale with a happy ending.
Chapter 5 begins with a letter from Elizabeth, expressing her concerns for Victor and relating the story of Justine Moritz, who once lived with the Frankenstein family, who was returned to stay with them after the death of her mother. This is actually a fairly unimportant chapter in the novel, largely serving as a way to restore Victor to health and regain his sense of control. That said, it is important to acknowledge how Justine serves a purpose in the narrative. She's been accused of causing the death of several members of her family, and now is living under the roof of the people most important to Frankenstein. This is important because at the beginning of Chapter 6, Frankenstein receives a letter from his father telling him that his younger brother William has been murdered, and begging Frankenstein to return home immediately.
That it's Frankenstein's child brother who's died is important because the death of a child often symbolises the loss of innocence and purity within a novel. William serves as a link for Frankenstein to a purity and innocence which he can no longer lay claim to after creating and abandoning the monster.
The loss of a child can also be read as a reference to the parental dynamic between Victor and the monster, and how Victor wishes to treat the monster as if it is dead to him. This is a novel that is filled with orphans of all ages, shapes and sizes. Remember that we open this novel with the letters of Walton, a man set forth alone in the Arctic, away from his family. We meet the orphaned and adopted Elizabeth in Chapter 1, and now we have the death of a child, which prompts us to question what other horrifying consequences will occur as the novel progresses.
That the knowledge of his brother's untimely death comes to Frankenstein in the form of a letter is a core part of any Gothic story. Letters and documents are epistolary storytelling tools and root the reader with the sense that the things that they are reading are based in truth. Because this tale is being told within a framed narrative, it's easy for us to feel distant from it, and therefore easier for us to disbelieve. Letters with solid facts in them help to ground us, make the whole story feel more real, and therefore more terrifying.
Victor returns home, and the changing seasons reflect his state of mind. The placid lakes and idyllic mountain valleys are juxtaposed with the murder of his brother, and represent how Frankenstein is in denial about what he has done. It's also amongst these picturesque settings that Frankenstein sees the shadow of his creature for the first time since creating it, standing near the site of his brother's death. The sighting is relayed to us through a classic horror trope of a dark and stormy night.
I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lighting illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature, and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life.
This moment is rich in sublime and Gothic imagery, which disturbs and unsettles the previous images of placid lakes and calm countryside, filling us as readers with a sense of chaos. The picturesque landscape, which had, up until this point, been tranquil and calm, is transformed by lightning and the sight of his brother's death. We get a sense at this moment that Frankenstein has lost control, and this is only enhanced by his declaration that it must have been the monster, his own creation, that killed his brother.
When Victor returns home, it is with a renewed sense of anguish and guilt. He feels the responsibility for the death of his brother heavy on his shoulders. This is only made worse when Justine, the ward of his family, is accused of the murder. This is the second innocent to be caught up in Frankenstein's aborted creation, and when she's put on trial, Frankenstein's sense of guilt only grows stronger. His only solace comes from his belief that there is no evidence to convict her.
In this assurance I calmed myself, expecting the trial with eagerness, but without prognosticating an evil result.
It's interesting in this section that Frankenstein not only states that Justin cannot be guilty of his brother's murder, he extends this statement to every human being. This is both an accusation of the monster and also an attempt to distance himself from responsibility, as he of course accounts himself amongst humanity.
Chapter 6 closes with Victor and Elizabeth reunited, and Victor treats us readers with a description of the beautiful woman she has become.
Time had made great alterations in her form since I had last beheld her. 6 years before, she had been a pretty, good-humoured girl, whom everyone loved and caressed. She was now a woman in stature and expression of countenance, which was uncommonly lovely. An open and capacious forehead gave indications of a good understanding, joined to great frankness of disposition.
While Frankenstein is obviously very taken with Elizabeth, as readers there are clear links between Elizabeth's frank disposition and the innocence of Justine. This, combined with Frankenstein's feverish premonitions, suggests to us that Elizabeth will be put in a similar danger to Justine, perhaps even more so considering Frankenstein's affection for her.
Once again, this has been an intense few chapters, with Frankenstein's creation of the monster, his abandonment of the creature, and its seeming first act of revenge for that abandonment. We as readers are now firmly invested in Frankenstein's story, and current events, plus heavy foreshadowing, have created an unavoidable sense of dread.
Next episode, we'll be talking about chapters 7 and 8, the trial of Justine, and the events that follow as the monster's influence on Frankenstein's life becomes more pronounced and more horrifying.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next episode.